providing good it's a hard life being content provider. Okay, well that's bad. I should have taken this one really, it's my fault. No, they were like entertaining, I can't make it.
Okay, let's make a start. Thank you everyone for coming to this very topical debate. Let's have a show of hands in the audience. Who thinks that opening some new grammar schools might be a good idea and might improve the education system in this country? We've got 1, 2, 3. Okay, but for the rest of you, we want to try and explain to you not really so much about the evidence about why grammar schools might be damaging for the education system, but more have a discussion about what we might do to win over the general public and Tory MPs to help make the case against grammar schools. So on the panel today to help us do this, we've got me, I'm Becky Allen, I'm from an organisation called Education Data Lab. I hang my career on the idea that empirical evidence and data can help win arguments and improve the education system. I'm not sure that's true in this case. We have Jonathan Porter. Jonathan works at Michaela Community School. He's going to really talk about, I think, some of the perspectives of what he thinks comprehensive education needs to look like in order to produce schools that he thinks are going to be a compelling vision to persuade the grammar school lobby to think again. Ed Dorrell from the Times Education Supplement, talking about the perspective of how you make arguments and win over the public. And then Sam Friedman from Teach First, who's formerly a government advisor. So I'm going to start by just showing you a few charts of the arguments that I think you have to make and you have to get understood and won by politicians in order to win this argument. The first argument I think we have to make is that academic selection doesn't just create a set of winners, it also creates losers. And it's quite a tough argument for us to make. You know, I don't know whether any of you work in secondary moderns. We don't want to be going out there rubbishing our colleagues who do teach in these places. But we do need to make the argument that children who go into secondary moderns are worse off than if they were in an all-ability school. I think it's important we make that argument. So these are showing the gains and losses on a best 8 GCSE score on progress measures to go to a grammar school versus a secondary modern. But actually the academic literature is pretty consistent in saying that there's these kind of gains and losses for children. Why do I think that's happening? Well, one reason why is that resources flow into grammar schools where you have academic selection. The most important resource, as you all know, is you. And it turns out that grammar schools have an easier time recruiting teachers, keeping teachers, having teachers that are qualified, and having teachers that are experienced. Again, it's quite an uncomfortable argument for teachers to have to make, but the evidence shows that secondary moderns are in a really difficult place and struggling to recruit well-qualified staff to do the job. Why do we care about the losers? Actually, loads of government policies create winners and losers. It's almost inevitable in most policies that we do so. We care a lot about the losers in this case, because the losers in these systems are more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds. So, they're more likely to come from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're less likely to pass the 11+. Now then, there's one argument that just says they're less likely to pass the 11+ because they don't get tutored in the test, they don't go to private prep schools. And that's this kind of argument that says if we take children, for example, this is in the 4 big selected local authorities that we currently have, children who score a 5.0 on Key Stage 2, and we look at how likely they are in these areas to end up in a grammar school. The free-school meal kids, 18% of them will pass the 11+ and got in, 35% of those not eligible for free school meals with a flot in. So there's differences there. Okay, so this is actually what the government's hanging all its arguments on. They can't say that grammar schools are good for poor kids because there aren't any in those schools at the moment. So the argument they're saying is somewhere out there are bright children, and if we can just find them and get them through the test, everything's going to be okay. Okay, and everything would be better if we got this little set of children through the test. But that doesn't face up to the major problem with the selection, which is the bigger problem that just the unconditional differences in who doesn't get in are huge. And they are huge because at the age of 11, for whatever reason, children who are eligible for preschool meals are much, much lower attaining than those who are not. So we can't create these arguments that say we're going to find poor, clever kids and get them into selective schools. Because, well, even if we let them in with really, really low 11+ test scores, there's a quite strange question about what would happen to them in those schools, given their levels of attainment. And the consequences for all of that, well, this is like a different version of the Chris Cook chart, if all of you who are on Twitter have seen it, or on the BBC website. It just shows that in Kent and Medway, one of the biggest areas of selection in the country, the richer households are fine. Their academic outcomes are as good as in any areas without grammar schools. And their value added, or the progress of the children in secondary school who live in poorer households, is much, much worse. And we just put on to remind ourselves of a brilliant success story in the country of London. So those are the kind of empirical arguments I think we need to make in order to win the argument against grammar schools. But as I said, I don't think that any of this is enough. So we're now going to call on the rest of the panels to make some very different types of arguments, I think, about how we win.
Thanks very much. This is like no panel I've ever seen before. It's really dropped in the lion's den here. I joined the Conservative Party as a 23-year-old. Trained to teach in Birmingham, and I joined because I, perhaps naively, agreed with the sort of Govian education revolution. I believed then, and I believe now, that all children, regardless of their background, deserve a traditional academic curriculum. And for me, that is the essential problem with the 11+, selection at 11. That it says, essentially, there is one curriculum that is for some pupils, and there is another curriculum for other pupils. It says that there is a broadly academic curriculum for some pupils, and it says that there is a broadly functional utilitarian education for other pupils. Invariably, it says that there is an academic traditional curriculum for my children and a functional utilitarian education for other people's children. And, although Gove had many faults, I think at a deep level, he also agreed with that. And it explains some of the policy decisions he made, such as, for example, the EVATs, and, for example, the removal of so-called equivalents, which many of us will say were nothing like equivalents. So I find this sort of renewed emphasis on grammars, someone who joined the Conservative Party for those reasons, deeply depressing. However, I don't think that an attack on grammar school supporters as sort of Brexity, swivel-eyed loons, which might be the tendency of some people at educational conferences, is really going to help the case. Not least because my own dad in West Worcestershire is one of these sorts of people who agrees with grammar schools and says that there are features of grammar schools that are awful, and he does not see those features in enough comprehensive, certainly not in West Worcestershire. So what I think we need to do is we need to sort of pin down three aspects of the sort of comprehensive education that I think needs to focus more. We need to think about the features of grammar school education that those people like, and I think that they sort of fall down to curriculum, behaviour, and excellence. So on curriculum, I think the grammar school supporters say that there are not enough schools that champion that sort of traditional academic curriculum. I know I can see Stuart Locke here, head teacher of Cobham Village College, and I know that that is one school that champions that sort of academic curriculum. You've got West London Free School, you've got Bedford Free School, my own school, Michaela, explicitly champion that sort of curriculum that Gove also sought to achieve through the sort of changes to the performance measures. But we also know that there are many schools out there that champion a different type of education. I certainly have been trained in schools with a sort of discovery-based, pin the tail on the donkey sort of learning. And that I've actually used that as an activity before. You know, things like Hirsch and Willingham and Christodoli, which some of us might be aware of, lots and lots of teachers in the system are not aware. And they do not feel the need to change their practices or their curriculum in the same way that we might want to feel that. Certainly not as specifically. They're certainly not as specific. Secondly, there's the issue of behaviour. People associate grammar schools with the traditional forms of behaviour. And I would argue that behaviour in many, many other Britain schools is really, really, really bad. And that's not just my prejudices. You know, Ofsted brought out a recent report on low-level disruptions in schools. And many parents in those areas look at behaviour in comprehensive schools and they don't want it for their children. They have a traditional view of behaviour that says that if little Johnny is naughty, he should get attention. He shouldn't be inflicted with some sort of restorative justice programme and made to sit down and talk through his feelings with the teacher. The teacher should have to, you know, negotiate some form of settlement with him. So what I think that those people who support grammar schools are saying is that they want a more traditional attitude, first to curriculum, and a more traditional attitude to behaviour. Lastly, sorry, I'm slightly going on here, I think that there is an issue of what I call the pursuit of excellence. We know that there were lots of perverse incentives in the system prior to the reforms. There was a lot of energy spent moving children from D to C, maybe not so much energy moving pupils from A to a star. And there are, unfortunately, still some teachers, I think, who believe that if you're white, working class, or if you're black, or a single mum, that, frankly, certain universities are not for you. When I wrote my blog, I had, just by way of finishing, I had someone who emailed me and said that she had put these sorts of complaints to her teacher, who has a head teacher, in fact, who has an OBE in a school in London. And she said, you know, why don't we have a more traditional curriculum? Why don't we have more traditional attitudes towards behaviour in school? You know, some kids are just naughty. That's life. And why don't we champion excellence more than we do? And his answer was, and this is a head teacher with an OBE in a London school, these kids are never destined to be lawyers. And that, there are, unfortunately, some teachers out there who still do not believe that certain children deserve that sort of education. I think that that's profoundly wrong. It's something that Gove understood. And I think the comprehensives after win this argument, they need to show that they understand those comments about comprehensive education.
So I've been thinking quite hard about this recently, and I was thinking about what I was going to say today, and I thought a nice sort of subject or title for it would be Aunt Mabel and the Parable of the Bent Banana. So what we're looking at is a new world. We're looking at politics through a post-Brexit haze. When you look at the way this debate, the grammar school debate is going to be formed, you're looking at a post-fact world. The research is great and should not be ignored, but you're looking at an emotional reaction to a situation. You're looking at, that's what you have to defeat, that's what you have to take on. People who believe in comprehensive education need to start standing up and shouting about why it's great on a personal, human level. So what I'm going to do, what I'm attempting to do, is come to ResearchEd and tell you that research isn't the answer. It is sort of the answer, but we need to get beyond it. We learned a lot of lessons from Brexit. I'm unashamedly pro-Remain. I've written about why I was pro-Remain. But you've got the reason, in my opinion, that Remain lost in a large way was because they absolutely relied on a very on science and on research, and on making arguments which were really emotionless. There was no emotional argument made for why we should stay in the European Union. In the same way, we need to start talking up comprehensives. So, the problem we've got, those who want to support comprehensives, is the Aunt Mabel issue. Aunt Mabel is the fed banana, or the belief, the widespread belief in the general public that bananas have to be straight under European Union regulations, which is frankly bollocks. Similarly, everybody thinks they've got someone, I'm going to call it Aunt Mabel, whose life was transformed by grammar school education. That is a hugely personal experience. Not everyone, but a lot of people have got that. And it enters family law. That's what you're dealing with. So you've got to talk to people on a personal level. So people who believe in comprehensive education need to be talking about the people whose lives are transformed by comprehensive education. Michael Wilshaw got it a little bit in the interview he gave in the Times last Saturday. He deployed a bit of data in defence of comprehensive, but then he told a really good anecdote about how he'd been taken out for dinner recently by sixth form students whose lives, who he said, wouldn't have succeeded if they'd been brought up in Kent. That was done. They succeeded and went on to make huge successes of their lives because they grew up in a comprehensive system. It's a positive human story. Also, the arguments that, again, this is the human side, the arguments which are often made that you don't want your kids to go to a secondary model. So you say, the grammar school system doesn't work because you don't want your kids to go to a secondary model. It can sound a bit like your kid isn't clever enough to go to a grammar school. That's a really negative PR argument to make. People have huge aspirations for their children. And you say you've got an option, and this is perception, I'm not saying this is true, but you've got an option to have a really high-performing school drop next door to you, which your kid could go to because your kid is clever. Or not. You're not going to get that school. That's really interesting, isn't it? That's a really interesting position to take. Other issues I think that people defending comprehensive education need to deal with is what is comprehensive education? We've touched upon it, but what people think comprehensive education is, or what a comprehensive is, or the local com, isn't what we understand. They don't understand. They understand vaguely. People understand vaguely about 11+, but when you say comp, they don't think, oh, it's a comprehensive admission system. They see things like progressive education. They see a school status. There's a negative phrase around the comprehensives. Absolutely negative phrase. It's quite clever, I think, actually, under the last government to reinvent them as academies. That's, I think, part of the same argument. I have a thesis which I've written about a little bit, that kids from a working class background who succeeded in the 50s and 60s succeeded because they went to grammar school. Kids from a working class background who succeed now succeed despite going to comprehensive school. That is the perception out there. What has to be? I don't know if I'm rambling there. So we've got to define what we're defending. We're defending the comprehensive admission system. There is a whole other argument that Becky and Johnny have touched on, Becky writing in the CES studies now, about what kind of education goes on. And there's strong emotional arguments for changing the pedagogy and the curriculum inside the schools, which I think you almost set to one side, because A, it's going to take a long time for that to happen, and it's going to be way too long for this conversation. We're talking about in the next year or two. We can't say, it's going to be fine, we don't need grammar schools, because in 15 years' time, the whole landscape of what's taught and what isn't taught in our schools is going to be different. That's too late for everyone. And on a very similar note, and this is the problem that those who want to defend grammar schools have to deal with, is too much of the debate about grammar schools and comprehensives is a proxy. It's a proxy debate for progressive versus traditionalist. And so that's a real problem for a lot of people in this room. If you associate ResearchEd with more of the Johnny Come approach. That's a really difficult stumbling block. I'm not saying you can't overcome it, but there's a proxy in the wider debate. If you read a leader in the Mail or an op-ed in the Telegraph, they're not really talking about emissions. They might seem to be, but if you read below the surface, what they're talking about is a traditional education. And if we get caught up in that, then, you know, we lose, basically. Anyway, that's fine.
Okay, so my job is how do we defeat this pile of garbage in Parliament? The first thing to say is we're a long way away from this actually getting to a vote in Parliament. The thing that's being launched on Monday is a green paper. I never worked on a green paper myself because a green paper is basically an admission that you haven't got a clue what you're doing. A green paper is a very early stage kind of, here's some thinking, and we're doing a wide consultation on it. And there will be a wide consultation on it. It will be quite open, I believe, the green paper that we're going to see on Monday. So first thing, for God's sake, do reply to the consultation, say what you think, everybody. I know it can seem a bit pointless, governments don't read anything people send in. 97% of people who reply to that are against it. It's quite hard for them to hide that. Laura will put in an FOI, we will find out. So do reply to the consultation on the green paper, that's really important. But also it means we're a long way. So after a green paper, let's say they want to keep going ahead with it. I think they'll probably have to. It's the Prime Minister's first announcement. It's going to be, to just back down on it quickly would be a big admission of defeat, so they're not going to do that. We will probably see a white paper. So when it gets to the white paper stage, it will be set out in more detail. We'll get a bit of a better sense of exactly what it is that they're planning on doing. Another opportunity to reply to a consultation. Another opportunity to fight it through the press and so on. It's at that stage that you start having more parliamentary votes on this kind of thing. So once the white paper there will be a vote on the white paper, it doesn't really bind anyone to anything. It then goes to become a bill. They have to turn it into a piece of legislation, which is going to be phenomenally difficult given the actual policy content of what they talked about in the speech on Friday. And as well as they've thrown in a whole like faith schools, independent schools. I mean, you couldn't ask for a more complicated, controversial piece of legislation. So it'll take them a while to get to that point. Let's say it takes them somewhere between 6 months and a year if they're being really speedy. So then they have a bill that has to go to Parliament. So what's the makeup of Parliament, assuming you don't have an election, assuming it's this Parliament for the time being? Labour MPs, bar 1 or 2, are all going to vote against. Lib Dems, all 8 of them, will vote against. DUP will vote for. A lot of the other Irish MPs, Sinn Féin, don't vote. So the really interesting one is not actually how, like the Tories, you've got maybe 20 or 30 who will probably vote against, who could be persuaded to vote against if the legislation is bad enough, who are the sort of modernisers.
Look at Michael again.
I have no idea what Michael's view is on this, but Nicky Morgan came out yesterday, which was great. Leo Carmichael, the head of the select committee, has already come out. So we know there's some, Sarah Wollaston, there's already some backbenchers speaking out. I think we could probably get 20 or 30 modernisers. So the issue, and they could defeat it if everyone else voted against, because the majority is only 12. The issue is going to be what the SNP do. Now, the SNP supposedly don't vote on things that only affect England, but they have defined this fairly liberally in the past to include anything that they want to make a point about. So they may choose to vote against this on second reading, and if they do, it could be defeated on second reading. If they don't, it's very hard to defeat it on second reading because that's 56 MPs who all abstain. Once it goes past second reading, because of the crazy new English votes for English laws thing that's come in, they actually don't get a say through the committee stage. Only English MPs get a say through the committee stage. It's very confusing, I won't go into it. But they do have a chance to defeat it second reading. Let's say they abstain. Then you have to find 50 or so, maybe 60 Tory MPs to vote against it. That's hard. Firstly, because a lot of them actually support it, and nothing any of us say is going to convince them. Otherwise, they're emotionally. Graham Brady, taken to the worst secondary model in the country, he is going to support grammar schools until he dies. So are quite a few other Tory MPs. But there's a quite a large group in the middle who don't really care. Education's not their big issue in Parliament. To vote against it is quite a big deal for them because it means that they lose capital with the Prime Minister, with the whips on other issues. It obviously drops them down the line for jobs in the future and so on. If they were a minister, they'd have to resign. So it would be a big deal if you don't really care about this issue. So how could we get some of those MPs to care about it? well, I think some of the things that Ed's talked about. Actually, grammar schools are not as popular as people think with the wider public. And they're not popular with parents. And this is a really important distinction. The YouGov polling, I actually put it on Twitter last night, and the most recent YouGov polling, if you ask just, do you support grammars or do you want to close them, you'll get a decent majority in favour of I support grammars. If you ask, do you want to open new grammars, keep the status quo, or close grammars, you actually get a small majority for keep the status quo or close. So there's not actually a majority amongst the wider population for increasing the number of grammar schools. And if you look at the age group 25 to 50, there's actually quite a sizable majority against opening new grammar schools. So it's not like we've got nothing to work with the public here. I mean, Ed is much more sort of romantic and about these things than I am. I think you need to scare the shit out of people that think they're getting these schools. That's what destroyed grammar schools last time. They closed, not because government said we're closing all the grammar schools, they closed because in places like Leicester and there were rallies against them because parents were really worried their kids would end up in secondary modern education. And that's the most effective way of getting voters scared, writing to their MP and getting those who don't really care, they're more interested in foreign policy or defence policy or something, but maybe think, actually this is quite a good idea, maybe I'm not going to vote against it, but at least I'll go to the whips and say, if you don't make some changes, I'm going to vote against it. Start getting that kind of rebellion moving in the party. Okay, so let's say it's not defeated in the Commons. The SNP abstained, can't get 60 Tory MPs to vote against. That's probably the most likely scenario. The next stage, it has to go through the Lords, and this is really important because it wasn't in the manifesto, obviously. So the Salisbury Convention doesn't apply. The Salisbury Convention says that if something's in the manifesto, the Lords have to vote it through. Eventually, they can fiddle around with it, they can complain, they can try and make some amendments, but basically the Lords have to vote for it. They very, very rarely break the Salisbury Convention. It's not actually a law, but they very rarely break it. If it's not in the manifesto, they can and will vote it down. And there's nowhere near a majority for this in the Lords. It's ironic that we're relying on the Lords to have this ability, but there we go. The Tories have a minority. Labour and Lib Dems combined have more than the Tories. There are lots of Lib Dem Lords. One of the things that Nick Clegg did right for his party was to get a lot of Lords in, who will vote unanimously against, pretty much. And the crossbenchers are really important. So we need to make sure at least a decent number of crossbenchers would oppose it if it came to a vote. So you can find out who they are, and if you have any connection with them, you can engage with them as well. But I actually cannot see how in its current form they can get this piece of legislation through the Lords. It would also be interesting to see what some of the more senior Tories in the Lords, like Gillian Shepherd, who was an education secretary, say as well, because that can swing things. The Lords is a very different chamber from the Commons. It isn't shouty in the way that the Commons is. It's a good speech can actually make a difference to the Lords. So that will be interesting too. So that's kind of a bit about, and if it's defeated the Lords, then it will bounce back and forth between the Commons and the Lords. They will end up having to amend it. Just one final point quickly I wanted to make is the other thing that can be useful, we talked about sort of emotion, winning a broader argument. The actual policy really matters, and this is where the fact they haven't had time to think it through properly is going to come to the fore. Because if you look at what they're announcing on Monday, they're going to talk about any school can opt for selection. They haven't said what the criteria is, what the approval mechanism is. But that really matters. If I'm an MP in Kent who actually really supports grammar schools, this could mess up selective education in Kent. Because there's so many potential unforeseen consequences in this legislation, because what if all selective secondary moderns decide that they want to apply to become selective? So there's also, I think we can really tease out the unintended consequences as well in the policy to get people who actually aren't opposed to grammar schools thinking, this isn't the right way to do it, let's stop, let's rethink, and that can buy us time as well. So there's just a few thoughts on the parliamentary side of this.
Thank you. Questions to the panel or any short comments, because we want to hear some of your views about how you think we can defeat this. I think we should try and do like 2 or 3 at a time, because when we have a panel it's easy to collect comments. So let's start with Nat front, and then was it you? Yeah, and then there.
Just a couple of quick comments. And context, I've just finished as an assistant head teacher in a secondary modern and was the free school meal kid that went to the grammar school down the road. So lots of emotion for me tied up in all of this. Couple of things. I think Ed is right on the positive message that we need to be telling. I'm not going to speak for all secondary moderns, but if you want to say things about my school to get this through, like, fill your boots, like, we do not mind. But I do think Sam's argument about the fear that parents have that their kid might not get in is important. I've already set Laura on a task of building a would my kid get in social media, plug some information in and it tells you. I think the vast majority of middle-class parents in Lancaster and Morecambe district, this is the single most stressful thing that they go through, and if they were to understand that their kid wouldn't get in, that is the thing that's going to tip their support over the edge. So anything smart and easy that they can do to actually understand if their kid would do it, I think is really, really important. And in the areas where there are great comprehensives, you can double the weight of that. We can't do that, but you can double the weight in areas where there are great comprehensives by saying, actually, your reasonably bright kid who's getting a really good deal at the moment would in another world get a really bad deal. So I think you need to use both of those stories together, and it needs to be incredibly personal for individual parents. They are all massively stressed out about this.
It's really fascinating, thank you. I had a question, particularly from Sarah, said, I can't see any way it gets to the Lords. Is it possible, particularly that mandate, is it possible, is this the start of an election campaign to get a mandate?
Let's do the last one. It was you, yes.
Just a really good comment there, Becky. I thought the graphs that you showed with some of the clearest exposition data I've seen in a long time. I just wanted to ask if they'll be available afterwards and how you can get these.
Sure, yes. Somehow, probably on my website, I'll find
Thank you.
Okay, so Sam, quick response, and then we'll have some more comments.
So just on the election thing, which is a sort of a theory that's doing the rounds at the moment, maybe, but I'm quite sceptical. She came up very strongly early on and said she wasn't going to call an election, so and the public really don't like people who just lie. And she also, her reputation, her good polling at the moment comes from stability, from looking like a safe pair of hands, suddenly calling another election on an issue that most people, it's not that important. Clearly, it's not important to most people. That's odd. I don't think that's what they're playing at, though I'm not sure what they are. I'm sceptical about that, but it is a theory doing the round.
Right, okay. 1, 2, and anyone else? 3.
So if we want a slogan, how about vote academies take control? I think that'd be a good one. One other thing. Write that down somewhere. One other thing. I remember seeing, I think, in Millennium Cohort study data that like 90% of mothers with no qualifications, like no qualifications at all, still want their kids to go to university. So parental aspirations are high, like really high, and that's arguably in some respects something to worry about. Because they want that, they're more likely to think it's realistic, and they more likely to support grammar. So something else to factor in.
I think if you want to win the argument, then sort of, say Ed was talking about, mocking Brexiteers for being emotional, but this is the most emotional room that I've sort of seen in quite a while. And you just need to recognise that it's not 1944 anymore. The educational landscape, if Brown's were to exist, would be completely different to that. You've got your academies, your multi-academy trusts, you've got your UTCs, the free school thing, you've got performance measures in Ofsted. It's just a completely different. You're not making the same argument. I don't know.
So your argument is that they wouldn't be so bad after this election because we have so much that.
I'm not passing comments on whether they're good or bad, just saying that it's.
It's a different type of argument.
Yes, it's actually different.
Okay, who was the third one for that one?
Just one thing quickly to add to the point Sam was just making about the election thing. It would also force the issue for Labour, or at least has the potential to force the issue for Labour. So that's also just taking back, I thought a lot of what was said was, really all was brilliant. One thing I did want to flag up was, I'm terribly sorry I've forgotten your name, John. The point you were making about the traditional curriculum I agree, but I think I work a lot with further education colleges as well, and I think that's a whole. I mean, further education colleges are really, actually the engine for education for most people in this country, really. And so there's some thought that needs to be given to how that all plugs into the argument that's being made on the broad scale.
I mean, the reality is we all agree with selection. I mean, we all agree with selection at some point. It just depends on where that point is. And I feel comfortable with that age being 16 or 18, where people will make a decision as to what path they want to take. And we need to make sure we have a system where it is not perceived that any route from that point at 16 or 18 is better or worse. I don't believe that that's true at all. But I also believe that there is a common body of knowledge that we as a society pass from one generation to another. And that is the, it sounds a bit romantic, but that is the birthright of a child that is born in this country. And that every child should have access to that to the point of about around 16. So I agree with you in the sense that I think there does need to be a conversation about what happens from 16 onwards. My opposition to selection at 11 is because I don't think that by that age we have been able to pass on great works of literature, language, science, maths, the whole gamut.
Just wanted to respond to Sam briefly. You said that in Leicester showing people they campaigned against it when they'd experienced it. The point is that they had experienced that sort of education. We're talking about, for most people now, who have no idea what we're talking about. So I think it's the aspirational thing that the real issue.
I think we're going to have one more round of questions. So we'll go to David, yes, you, and then we'll be done.
So I guess my thought here is that given parents are already quite anxious about the amount of cramming that goes in year 6, a really good argument here is to say, do you really want tens, if not hundreds of thousands of children to be put through a massively stressful process? And if we really focus on that stress that parents already feel, that would be a really good way of beginning to get parents to think, my goodness me, I just want a good school in my area without all the stress.
Okay, and yes?
A small point on public engagement. I think absolutely agree with all that's been said already. But obviously, there are lots of parents, lots of people who don't spend their weekends at conferences. This one, the Guardian comment section. What's the mechanism by which you transmit these messages? Who should be the messengers? How do you get the very people, the very beneficiaries of the great education system that we want to help to disadvantage actually get involved in that conversation as well? I think we learned in the last general election you can have a lot of conversations, but if they're not quality for the right people, it doesn't count for much. So we need to hear the council's thoughts on that.
Sure, and then finally.
So the big controversial bit, feel free to kind of swarm me at lunch, but I still think there's a scenario in which this could be okay. Can you quickly go back to the graphs and I can show you how they can be interpreted by people who are for this, and then you can defeat this later. That one is grammar schools get the best kids and make them even better before sending them on to university at a small loss to everyone else that would be insignificant. The next one about Kent is poor Kent schools are using grammar schools as an excuse, and excellent comprehensive schools around the rest of the country so show that you can have both. For example, Birmingham, you've got Perry Beaches, Nine Styles, Barbican, all the rest of them, and grammar schools. So grammar schools aren't the reason for the poor schools being poor. And the teacher drain one, that's you're using experience as a proxy for quality, and Michaela shows that you can only be teaching for 2 years and be some of the very best teachers in the country. So just something for you to think about.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really helpful to get that kind of pushback criticism. So let's just respond to the kind of how does everyone organise? Well, I think one of the kind of political problems is that historically the anti-grammar school lobby and things like Offensive Futures was actually built around stopping the right of the Labour Party from going down this path. And so it's very entrenched in the Labour Party, it's very it's quite entrenched in progressive education actually. And they're not the right people to be doing this and to win that argument. And at the moment, on the right, and in the Tory party, or on the kind of the liberal part of the Tory party, there isn't an organisation there that is going to bring everybody together to campaign. So how are we going to do it? Got no idea. Anyone else? Let us know. Anybody else want to contribute to that? John?
No. It's really hard.
Any ideas?
Yeah, it's really hard.
Well, I'll start. We're organised for the Fair Education Alliance. We're working closely with 70 organisations to try and create a coalition to stop this. So hopefully we can be a banner organisation people send their ideas to, got a petition out, all the things that we've discussed today we're working on, we're building up a plan for the next 6 months to a year. So hopefully we can be one of many sources of sort of support for people who want to sort of fight this particular policy.
Brilliant. I think on that note, just to allow you to get into your next sessions, thank you very much for coming.